Today I'm on McDougal Street in Greenwich Village, and lots of you probably know McDougal Street as being a part of the NYU community, or you might know it for its restaurants, cafes, and shops, or some of you might have been around long enough to even remember it as a part of the counterculture of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But today we're going to be talking about an incredible story related to this street that includes government corruption, voter fraud, freedom of the press, and 45 virgins. Are you ready? You're going to love this story. So our story starts many years before the streets of Greenwich Village were laid, back when we were a British colony and New York City was just a tiny town on the southern tip of Manhattan Island, less than a square mile in size. It's December 1769, and we are right in the middle of all of that really heavy protesting that was going on from the Stamp Act through the Declaration of Independence. So we're just right about in that period. And this broadside appeared: to the betrayed inhabitants of the city and colony of New York. It's a great title, isn't it? And what's a broadside? Well, the closest thing I can compare it to for you is a blog post, right? So if you have something you want to say, just like a blog, you write your opinion. You can't publish it on the internet, so you're going to go to a local printer, have him print it for you. You buy your copies. You're also going to use a fake name, right? A pseudonym. You don't want anyone to know who you are. And you and your friends will then put them up all over your town during the night. You might even lace them out in some taverns or coffee houses, places like that. Then everyone will read your opinion. They'll get together and they'll discuss it. A couple days later, your opponents will put one out in opposition to yours, and they'll tell everyone why you are wrong, and not only that, why you're a satanical and diabolical genius and no one should believe you. This is really where debate is taking place in those years leading up to the Revolutionary War, in these things called broadsides. And there are hundreds of these broadsides, but this one, to the betrayed inhabitants, is going to cause a 4-month fiasco in the city of New York. Now, right away, we can tell some things about who wrote this broadside. First of all, money. It was 2 pages long. It was expensive. So there's money behind this broadside. Second thing, the signature says, "A Son of Liberty." So we know it's someone who is either actively a member of the Sons of Liberty or someone who is affiliated with them. So right away, we know 2 things: big money, and they're against the king and the crown. The broadside comes out, and it's all about something called the Quartering Act. To understand the Quartering Act, let's go back a little bit to something called the Stamp Act. I bet you all remember the Stamp Act from school. If you're an American and you don't, you should. The Stamp Act was passed in 1765, a little about 10 years before the start of the Revolutionary War. And it was a tax on paper in the colonies. So all the paper in the colonies got taxed, as well as some other items. The purpose was to pay for something called the French and Indian War, and to continue paying for the soldiers that were left behind after that war. The colonies, you know, didn't want to pay the tax. They didn't like the Stamp Act. They united under the slogan, "No taxation without representation," stopped trading with England, and because of the economic impact, England repealed or withdrew the Stamp Act. It only took 3 months of that boycott of trade for the Stamp Act to be successfully repealed. So the colonies learned 2 really important things at that time. One, we had economic leverage over London. And 2, if we stuck together and we used that leverage, we could win on these issues. So 2 very important, lessons to be learned. Well, the Crown and the Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but they still needed money to support those soldiers. So they came up with another idea. And they said, well, if we can't tax you for the support of the soldiers, we'll make you tax yourselves. So in part, the Quartering Act says the colonial governments had to raise the money to pay for the troops, right, through taxes. How else would they raise it? And if they couldn't raise enough money, the residents would have to allow the soldiers to live in their homes at their own expense. So that, in part, is the Quartering Act. So, of course, nobody liked it. Everybody, united against the Quartering Act and said, you can do with the Quartering Act what you did to the Stamp Act. We are not going to raise a penny for this. And the colonies stayed united until 1769.
Here in New York, we had elections to our local colonial assembly. Remember, the governors of the colonies were appointed by the king. Most of the mayors were then appointed by the governors. So our representation really was like in our town common councils or in our colonial assemblies that we elected. So it was a big election. And that year, a different political party took over control of the New York Assembly, and they appropriated the money for the troops in New York and broke the unity of the colonies. Now, the colonies could only win on this issue if we were united. So New York now has broken that unity, and all of the other colonies are going to turn against us. We got some nasty letters from all of them, but the best one came from Philadelphia, which said, "Please send us your Liberty Pole, as it seems you no longer have a use for one." And the Liberty Pole was the place where we gathered to protest against the crown. They were very symbolic. So Philadelphia is saying, hey, why don't you just send us yours, because you don't need it anymore, you traitors. They even had a funeral march for New York City at Princeton College, then called the College of New Jersey, but Princeton College. And everyone was furious at New York for doing this. And so the Son of Liberty picked up his pen and he wrote his broadside to the betrayed inhabitants. And it's really long and melodramatic and wordy, but the gist of it says, "You men in New York elected an assembly to represent your best interests, and they don't care anything for you." Let me just stop here to say New York had very liberal voting rights, and virtually every free man of any race or religion could vote. So it wasn't just wealthy aristocrats voting in New York. So he says, you elected these guys to represent and to do what's best for you, and they don't care about you, because if they did, they would stand with our brothers in the other colonies and oppose this tax. By raising the money, they've shown all they care about is the family, through whose wealth, patronage, right, donations, and election fraud, they got elected. The Delanceys. We all know the Delanceys are associates of the king. Many of you, I bet, know Delancey Street on the Lower East Side. And Delancey Street is named for one of New York's two most powerful families. The Delancey family, which was loyal to the king, and the other powerful family that controlled the assembly up until 1769 were Livingstons, who were opponents to the king and the parliament. So now the Delanceys are not happy about this at all. The broadside goes into all of this detail about who took money from them, who they paid off, how people engaged in election fraud. It's 2 pages of really hair-raising stuff, and the Delanceys are not happy at all, right? They control the government. They don't like this, so they issue this proclamation along with our governor, Cadwallader Colden. So anyway, Cadwallader Colden issues this proclamation here. You can see God Save the King. It's all official and everything. And they say, we're willing to give a massive cash reward to anyone who will give up the author of the broadside. They say the broadside is a false, malicious, and seditious libel against the government. Now, they purposely use those words because in New York, already for over 30 years, we already had freedom of the press. And you couldn't arrest someone simply for stating their opinion. You had to prove that it was willingly and knowingly false. And in this case, they're saying it's not only false, but it's meant to overthrow the government. So this will give them the right to arrest the author and maybe even the printer. Some time goes by and a man came forward and he said, I'm not sure who wrote it, but I can tell you where it was printed because I saw it hanging to dry in that shop. And the owner of that shop, Mr. James Parker, and all of his employees were arrested. They were brought to Fort George, the military fort, put in separate cells and interrogated one at a time until Mr. Parker said, fearing for his life, he gave up the author. And the author was the great Captain Alexander McDougal. Now, Captain McDougal in 1769 is exactly what the aristocrats in England and here do not like. He is a 100% self-made man. And it's the self-made men and women of America up until that point that have made the colonies what they are. Captain McDougal's family had come from Scotland as peasant dairy farmers. When he was a boy, he delivered milk for his father's dairy farm. When he got a little older, he started working on ships. He then became a very successful ship captain, and by the time he wrote the broadside, about 38 years old, a successful merchant, a leader of the Presbyterian community, and a founder and leader of the New York Sons of Liberty. Every British pound and Spanish dollar Captain McDougal had, he earned himself. And at one of the meetings at the New York City Chamber of Commerce, he got up and addressed the group and asked them, if the king and lords of parliament only want to enslave you by taxing the wealth you yourselves created, what do we need them for? Look around you. Everything we have here, we have earned with our own hard work and determination. We have built all of it with no help from England. He went on to say that the Parliament was a distant and corrupt government that knew nothing of our way of life here. And a fellow merchant, responded and he said, Captain McDougal, I agree with everything you say, but if we don't have the King's great navy to protect our ships at sea, who will protect them? And Captain McDougal responded with an amazing answer. He said, well, it seems to me that if you don't fly the King's flag, his enemies no longer will be yours. That's considered sedition. So Captain McDougal is arrested for his comments and the broadside. He goes to jail and he's entitled to a bail hearing. Everyone was entitled to post bail in order to go home and await their trial. Now, Captain McDougal is a very wealthy man and he has lots of wealthy friends. So between all of them, they can put up the bail for him no matter how expensive it is. But the news reports of the time tell us that McDougal showed up in the courtroom all dressed up. They said he loved flamboyant clothes, packed courtroom, and they said with great flourish, with his Scottish brogue, which I cannot do, he announced, I'd rather go back to jail for the cause of liberty and freedom than pay this bail. The courtroom erupted into cheers and applause. Captain McDougal was taken back to jail, and he'll spend the next 4 months there. He's in jail in the basement of the City Hall on Wall Street. And Wall Street at that time is the main street of the town where everybody goes to stroll and everything is happening. So every day, his friends and supporters from the Sons of Liberty would go to the jail and cheer for Captain McDougal. And they would cheer 45 times. It was the number of his arrest warrant, but the number 45 had other significance to the people of the colonies. It was associated with a man in England named John Wilkes. John Wilkes was a man in the Parliament who often stood up for the colonies. He published a journal at that time. It was called the North Briton. And the North Briton number 45 was deemed to be so seditious and pornographic, he was arrested for printing it. Well, they had to release him from jail because he invoked a rule that said a member of Parliament couldn't be arrested for speaking. They had free speech. So they called McDougal now the Wilkes of the colonies. So the guys in the Sons of Liberty would go over, virtually every day and cheer for him 45 times. And the news reports tell us that some days they toasted him 45 times. And that one day a group of patriotic ladies arrived with a side of venison stamped with the number 45 that they presented to Captain McDougal. And on the 45th day of the year, they started out by roasting outside 45 pounds of meat. They toasted 45 times, and they brought 45 virgins dressed in white who sang the 45th Psalm from the Bible. Now, while all of this is going on, the newspapers are just full of articles about this. Articles in one newspaper, there's a whole series called the Dougaliad, which every week is satirizing and making fun of Captain McDougal and his followers. And the other newspaper is publishing articles in favor of Captain McDougal and his followers. And they are going back and forth in the newspapers, bouncing back and forth every week about this. But one of the funniest articles to appear says, we know our friends in the Sons of Liberty are up to their usual lies and deceptions with these purported virgins. As everyone knows, it is impossible to find 45 genuine virgins in the population of this town, especially who appeared to be 45 years old. And they're still going back and forth. McDougal is writing letters to another paper owned by a man named John Holt. He's writing letters to John Holt's paper defending himself. They're going back and forth. And this whole thing is going to go on for 4 months from January to April of 1770. Every week also, Captain McDougal is placing this classified ad in Mr. Holt's paper, telling the businessmen of the town that he's receiving them between 3 and 6 p.m. daily in the jail. So this is going to go on, right? January, February, March, April of 1770. And the whole thing comes to a conclusion when the only eyewitness to the crime, the printer who printed the broadside, remember, we have a right in America today to not be a witness against ourselves. That right comes from the English common law. At that time, people had a right not to be a witness against themselves. So McDougal couldn't be called as a witness against himself. The only witness was the printer. He died in his sleep of natural causes. The loyalists claim the Sons of Liberty poisoned him. They claim he murdered him, which they didn't do because, of course, Mr. Parker was one of them. But we have some fun going back and forth about that. But they had to drop the charges and release Captain McDougal. And about 500 people walked McDougal home in a parade. And he became a huge hero, triumphing over the Delancey faction and the crown. And I should also add here that Captain McDougal's broadside did bring about a big debate in the year 1770 over moving forward to a secret ballot. Because one of the things Captain McDougal and his allies said was that many people didn't vote their conscience because it was a public vote. You went and you voted in public verbally, and then your vote was recorded. So if you worked for a powerful family, or you were an artisan and they were customers of yours, or if you were employed by them, of course you would feel coerced to vote in the way they wanted you to vote. Or you might lose your job or lose your customers. And they said that this public vote was a coercive vote employed by the powerful to get the less powerful to do their bidding. So in New York in 1770, there began a call for a secret ballot, an actual written ballot that would then be tied up and dropped in a box and then counted by a number of people later, and then the votes tallied. Unfortunately, we're not going to get that until after the American Revolution, but really the call for that began in 1770 after this election of 1769. So the election is not only important for the broadside we're talking about, but for the changes it brought about in the way we voted. So Captain McDougal is now a free man, and it turns out that what he said about the Parliament being corrupt was correct, and everyone knew it because by 1774, this was printed in England, not here, but in England. It shows a member of Parliament taking an oath against bribes while taking a bribe from the East India Company at exactly the same time. So you might guess that this cartoon is about what's coming next, the Tea Act. This is about the Tea Act. Well, now that doesn't end our story about Captain McDougal. Captain McDougal is going to go on to be General McDougal. He will command the 1st New York Division of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. And after the war, he will be the first president of the board of the Bank of New York, started by his friend Alexander Hamilton. Today, Captain McDougal is buried at the Presbyterian Church at 5th Avenue and 12th Street underneath the church sanctuary. And that is the story of how McDougal Street got named for freedom of the press, election fraud, 45 virgins, and a really, really brave New Yorker, Alexander McDougal.
Thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that incredible story about New York City's early history. Be sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of these. And by the way, Ben's Pizza behind me was the #1 favorite spot for me and my friends to hang out when we were students at NYU. That gives you an idea of just how long Ben's has been here. Again, thanks very much for watching. Until next time, I'm Karen Q.